Hello, and welcome back to Bugs in My Brain. If I look like crap, it's because it is hot out. It is so fucking hot right now. I'm going to be turning away from my usual anime discussions and focusing on a passion that I've had for almost all my life at this point, which is Monster High. Listen, I love Monster High, and I've liked it since its release in 2010. Technically, I didn't really swing around until 2011, but that is early enough in Monster High's continuation where I consider myself one of the OG fans. I remember being like 7, 8 years old and like going on the Monster High website, being so excited every week for a new webisode to come out. I had played all the games. I deep dived all the character bios, even as a child, because I was just so captivated by this doll line. It was like nothing anybody had ever seen before. And before I liked Monster High, I was into Tim Burton. I was a Tim Burton kid, and so when Monster High came around, I was like, oh my gosh, I love this. This is everything I ever needed. The amount of knowledge I have about Monster High is enough for a whole encyclopedia, but most of that pertains to Monster High Generation 1. Today, I wanted to compare and review Monster High's latest generation, the TV show, the dolls, and how that holds up to Generation 1. Is Generation 3 really so bad as a bad taste in Monster High's mouth? I want to give a fair warning while I am discussing a doll line that is geared towards children. I tend to swear like a pirate, and I'm not very PG on this channel, so this is more towards, like, adult fans, so don't show your 10-year-old who really likes Monster High this. Please don't. Does Monster High Generation 3 hold up to the original? In my opinion, yes. Monster High Generation 3 was a breath of fresh air in comparison to Generation 2. And while I personally don't like the live-action movies all that much, I do think that the animated TV series and the dolls are very good. There's a lot of Generation 1 fans that hate this version of Monster High with a passion, and I'm not one of them, for a few reasons. So let's enter here. What made Generation 3 a successful reboot to such an iconic franchise based on the fundamental themes of, fashion, diversity, and being yourself? I will say, I do have a few issues with Generation 3, but these issues are so personal and minuscule compared to all the good that Generation 3 has to offer. And if you're an original fan who's still skeptical about this version of Monster High, I implore you to give the show and the dolls a chance. They are really charming. Number 1, addressing the cultural appropriation problem. One thing that Monster High Generation 3 has done justice in comparison to Generation 1 is their portrayal of different cultures. Monster High Generation 1 was a mess when it came to this. And after a certain point in the series, Monster High starts using different cultures and ethnicities as essentially just like props and an excuse to make more dolls to make more money. And so we can have like all these lines of cultural appropriative dolls and movies and characters with gimmicky accents that are often voiced by white voice actors. Monster High was fumbling from the beginning on this because Claudine and Cleo, being the only like 2 POC main characters, are both voiced by a white woman, the same white woman. And, you could chalk this up to early 2010's bullshit, which it really was. I do think Monster High was attempting to be inclusive and diverse, but in turn, in doing this, we got a lot of harmful stereotypes of characters and misinformation about cultures. I don't think Monster High was intentionally trying to be racist, but Monster High Generation 1's attempts to tackling the race issue was icky. Often using, like, monster wars to symbolize the real racism in the real world. It wasn't always in such great taste because we get some equivalents to, like, the All Lives Matter bullshit in Fright On.
Guys, the vampires are trying to take over the school. You guys are doing the same thing. It's not right. Well, we have to do something, or else we'll be serving them for the rest of our lives. The pack is strength. Take a pamphlet. I'll take them all.
I still appreciate it for what it is and what it served at the time. I will say that I really do like that TV special. I remember when it first came out, I was so excited to watch it on Nickelodeon. No sane children's TV series is going to tackle topics of race in this way in the great 2025. At least I hope not. Monster High's latest generation has done a fantastic job at keeping that inclusion of different cultures without butchering them. There's a lot of arguments about the choices to make, previously white characters be, people of color. In this generation, into that, I say, get off of Fox News. Monster High's POC representation in the early 2010s was not the greatest, and it imposed a lot of stereotypes, which may have left some fans feeling like, oh, maybe I don't belong at Monster High after all. Having characters like Draculaura, who's often regarded as like a favorite among fans, being a woman of color now, she's half Taiwanese, is actually quite positive in my opinion. And with characters like Laguna and Abby, and the so-called race bending that happened with those characters, it was really a way to depict their monster adaptations more accurately. The creature of the Black Lagoon was originally from the Amazon, which makes sense with Laguna being Latina now. Abby being from the Himalayas and having a Russian accent made no fucking sense, because the Himalayas are based in, among India and Nepal and a couple of other, South Asian, Middle Eastern countries. Recently, we've seen a character design change with Jennifer. Hold on. Have that one. She looks like that now. And the reason for this change, I'll have to dig out some resources for proof, but this change was made to more accurately depict how Chinese mythology has depicted dragons, who typically don't breathe fire. Her original skin color being yellow was bad, for an obvious reason. And I don't think I gotta explain that to you. I still like, those original characters a lot, even, maybe even more so than some of the new ones, because of my Generation 1 bias. But I do think that these new, more culturally sensitive depictions of these characters is a great favor to this franchise and for children to grow familiar with concepts of diversity. Number 2, queer body image and neurodivergent representation. This is a bit of an addition to my first point, except the original Monster High almost never included these kinds of representation. There's some connotations in Ghoulia's bio that suggest that she may be autistic, but having a zombie of all characters be neurodivergent when, the zombie characters are always associated with being slow and unable to talk coherently is weird. Twyla is a great choice for an autistic representation, and we get dialogue from her explaining her autism, how she values and needs alone time, how she uses her bracelet for stimming to regulate her emotions. And we even get the scene where she asks a DJ for noise-canceling headphones so that she can be included in the party. This is great! There's some old fans that think Monster High turned into some woke show, and I think that those people missed the point of the original Monster High, which was all about inclusion and being yourself, even if the way that they tackled it back then was messy. From a representation standpoint, having a character in a children's television series explicitly say they are autistic and explain how it affects them is very good for children who maybe are growing up in households that, don't explain to them the complexities of autism. It allows for a more empathetic and tolerant worldview to grow, which normalizes autism, but also recognizes why autistic people need accommodations and patience. As for queer representation, I can already hear it coming. I can already hear it. Children don't need to be exposed to that. Listen, Monster High has already been the punching bag for Christian mothers since it came out. This franchise has been known to push these social norms in children's media. So to include queer characters in a series that emphasizes acceptance just makes sense. Monster High Generation 1 wanted to include queer representation. Garrett Sander, creator of Monster High, he said that Valentine was always intended to be a gay character. Kiyomi is heavily implied to be a lesbian with a crush on Draculaura in the movie Haunted. After years of popular fan headcanons, Garrett Sanders decided to confirm Claudine as being gay. Back then, Mattel wasn't ready for it, according to Garrett, who is a gay man himself. So, queer representation always had a place in Monster High. It was just, early 2010s bullshit. None of these instances, other than, Kiyomi, who could be mistaken for just having this unusual interest in Draculaura for some weird reason. Nobody was explicitly shown to be queer in Monster High Generation 1. Frankie being non-binary only irks me for the reason of I am really sick and tired of robot, mutant, or lizard characters always being the non-binary representation, because it feels really dehumanizing to me. However, Frankie is a very positive portrayal of a non-binary person because of the fact that Frankie typically presents as feminine, kind of. Frankie still wears skirts and has a lot of pink going on. And this subjects the expectation that non-binary people are always meant to be super androgynous. I think that having one of your core characters be non-binary and express their pronouns in the show is freaking legendary and arguably historic in queer representation at this point. Also to mention, the various queer relationships in Monster High Generation 3, which stirs up debate, but after watching the show, I think that these relationships were tackled really well, especially Frankie and Cleo. And to people who insist children don't need to see this, being queer is not perverse. We had stacks upon stacks of heterosexual relationships in Monster High Generation 1. And that was always normal, even when we had Draculaura fantasizing about a plethora of shirtless quads at a beach. These queer relationships are far more appropriate, and they're a little bit more normal and feel more realistic for, high school relationships. For the argument that probably pisses me off the most, Draculaura's redesign was so comforting for me, personally, as somebody who was short with, thicker thighs. I looked at this new Draculaura and I was like, oh my gosh, that is me. And she is so awesome. I love it. And considering, Draculaura has always been short in the webisodes, in the movies, even in Generation 1, I felt like this change for Draculaura's doll design was kind of long overdue. Caddy Noir stirred up a lot of debate. My only issue with this doll is how damn ugly her outfit is. Humans come in all different shapes and sizes. It's not always due to diet or whatever. And even if it is, this doesn't make plus-size characters less valuable or less deserving of spotlight in children's media. I know I said humans and we're talking about monsters, but we have gone through generations of plus-size characters, specifically plus-size women, being portrayed as ugly and evil and bad. This body positivity is so extremely important because original Monster High dolls, while I love and I treasure them, are extremely thin. Thinner than Barbies, which were already getting eyed on unrealistic body expectations. Look at this doll. She's very thin at Monster High, where characters are so iconic and unique. Having characters that children can look up to and relate to is very important. And, it teaches that you do not need to be thin or conventional to be your very own Monster High superstar. And for the record, the majority of these dolls are still thin. The only ones that I can think of that are thicker are Draculaura, Abby, and Caddy. Point number 3, the dolls. When we compare Generation 1 and Generation 3's dolls, I generally do prefer the older dolls for the sole purpose that the outfits are better. However, Generation 3 did something very genius and way more efficient than Generation 2. Parents have been ridiculing these dolls back and forth for being slutty and revealing, to which I think is fucking dumb. I grew up with Monster High in a time where most of my friends were not allowed to play with these dolls or watch television show because of how they dressed, and that they were demon dolls. In retrospection, no little girl really needs to be dressing up like the original Monster High characters, but the major issue I'm seeing with these characters' outfits is legs. But take Draculaura's original outfit. She's actually mostly covered, but the pigtails and heels and the gothic look was too much for parents. To be honest, when I first saw Monster High, I remember seeing the Gloom Beach dolls, and I did think to myself, are these stripper dolls? Generation 1 Monster High was more suggestive with their outfits, so to counteract this, we got the garbage of Generation 2 of Monster High, which did a full 360 and made Monster High's characters look babyish and gave them really cheap, ugly outfits. Generation 3 met this issue in the middle. These characters look appropriate, with most of them wearing, normal shoes, actually, instead of heels. Their outfits aren't very provocative. but they are stylish. The Draculaura, again, like, she still looks awesome, but she has, like, this looks like a more reasonable outfit that a middle schooler would want to wear or something, you know? I think Monster High found a great way to incorporate more of their alternative fashions and still keep it appropriate enough that, you know, a child can dress as one of these characters for Halloween and it's not going to be a big deal. The original dolls are my favorite, but the new ones in comparison to Generation 2's dolls are detailed, they're full of personality, and still keep true to Monster High's philosophy on being unique. Now, let's get to what I don't like about Generation 3. And there really isn't a whole lot that I hate about this generation of Monster High, but I have a couple of complaints from the perspective of a Generation 1 fan. One of them being the live-action movie. It is not exactly horrible. I just personally didn't like how campy it was. The decision to romance Claudine and Deuce just for it to mean nothing in the next movie. Laguna's design change. She started to grow on me. I do think she's a nice looking doll, but I do prefer Laguna's original blue color scheme. I also wish that Claudine and Toralai's relationship was explored more before the cancellation of the live action movies and the animated series, because the ship is interesting to me, and we do get a little bit more content in the spin-off comics that are based on the Generation 1 universe. But I really wanted to see them flesh this relationship out a little bit more to give it a little bit more, like, believability, if that makes sense. Probably my biggest complaint with Generation 3 is the exclusion of two, technically one, character, Holt and Jackson. When I was a kid, I was obsessed with these two very similarly to how I'm obsessed with Shigaraki and Elle now. But these two characters got totally retconned. They gave the whole Jekyll and Hyde lineage to the teacher. I have, you know, a theory why Jackson and Holt haven't been included up to this point. You know, some could argue that Generation 1 Jackson and Holt, the only Jackson and Holt as we know, were some weird excuse for DID representation, if you really want to get that far down into thinking about it. Generation 3's careful treatment of diversity, it's hard to really portray this in a way that isn't going to come off as damaging or attribute to stigma about that condition. However, with all the creative liberties that this generation of Monster High has taken, I do think that something different could have happened here. Like, for example, maybe they were born as twins instead of the same body. I don't know. But Jackson and Holt were really interesting characters and absolutely my favorites of all, like, the Mansters. Even if they wanted to keep these characters combined, I think that they could have handled it well, considering that Deuce's snakes and Claudine's Moonclaw kind of given schizophrenia stigma, playing up that, you know, hearing voices trope. That part of Monster High Generation 3 I was not a fan of. Claudine has already taken the bit of being half human, which makes Jackson's role in Monster High all but unnecessary at that point. But I think these are fantastic characters that got absolutely wasted. And at this point, I don't know how a television series will move on for Monster High, but maybe they still have time to integrate them. Like, please, I want a Holt and Jackson 2-pack. I've been wanting this for 13 years. That's basically all I have to say, and wraps up to my conclusion that Monster High Generation 3 is different than Generation 1, but the way that it differs actually does Monster High justice and takes accountability for the harmful representation patterns of the first generation. To discredit these changes to being woke kind of disregards Monster High and what it intended to stand for from the beginning. And I really hope that this continuation of Monster High finds its footing, because while I'm glad that they're moving away from Nickelodeon, I really want to see this franchise flourish. That is basically all I got to say about this topic. If you want to see me cover more Monster High or more Death Note or more Shigaraki, I'm thinking about integrating Telltale's The Walking Dead in here soon. I really want to talk about that game because it's one of my favorites. If you want to see more of that, hit that subscribe button and like the video. That would be very nice of you. Thank you and goodbye.